And welcome back to the panel discussion, Reducing Risk in the Cloud for Government, sponsored by Microsoft, here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. Our guests today are Steve Hernandez, the Chief Information Security Officer for Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General; Mark Williams, the Chief Security Officer at Microsoft Federal; Melinda Rogers, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Justice Department; and Gary Bartlett, the CIO of the Postal Service Inspector General. And just before the break, we were talking about transparency into the cloud environment that you are buying. And Gary, I wanted to continue with you on that same question. What are you looking for? What kind of information do you want from cloud providers, and how do you get it?
Well, I think Mark hit the nail on the head. Just tell us everything, let us see everything, and everybody will be happy. Obviously, I mean, there's always a challenge, right? When you're dealing with a cloud provider, understanding what can they tell you, what can they give you access to, is it enough? We've had some instances with some cloud outages where it took us longer than normal to get some clarification on what's causing the outage, how long, what kind of duration are we expecting. You really want that stuff to be fed to you, not have to go searching for it, right? And I think that's the biggest challenge right now as these cloud providers get more and more comfortable working with institutions within the government to understand that, we need that feed being pushed to us to tell us, hey, there's an outage, or hey, there's an issue. Certainly if it's a security issue, that's really the biggest concern. That's what keeps me up at night is there going to be a security issue that I'm going to find out about because I read it in the paper, not because I got called from the cloud provider to tell me there's a security issue. So as much transparency as possible and as much push to us as possible. I mean, that's what we look for, I think.
And let me just bore in on that a little bit, because between the cloud facility, the physical, there is a data center somewhere, and your own facility, there's a wire, and then there's a whole network infrastructure. Where does the cloud provider end and Postal Service begin? And that is to say, if there's an outage, how do you know it's not one of your own routers and not the cloud?
Sure, and that's always that's the age-old IT. It's the dis and end, right? No matter how you look at it, it becomes a partnership. We deal with it today when we're dealing with long-haul providers, that actually provide the circuits, and it has to be a partnership. It has to be let's get everybody on the phone and let's start working through this and figure out where's the break. It comes down to trust and partnership.
So in an ideal world, the cloud would call you and say, hey, you got a router out. It ain't us, but you got to fix that.
Or at least hey, we're noticing that you're not getting X. We're noticing bounce back. We're noticing a congestion. We're noticing delays. Check something on your end. Even to that extent, even if they couldn't pinpoint what the problem was, even to be able to tell us, we noticed that a service has stopped, or we realize that because of monitoring, you're not getting something you're supposed to be getting. So that would certainly be helpful.
So is this something that you can build into the service level agreement if need be?
So I think you can try. I think the challenge right now is just reality. Reality gets in the way of trying to write a service level agreement or a contract that's going to cover every possible situation is almost impossible. I think it really comes down to a partnership with your vendors, building that relationship, building that trust, making sure everybody has the right phone numbers to call. Simple things like that. I think it's just one of those things where you kind of work through over time, and unfortunately, some of them you're going to be lessons learned after an incident has occurred.
So, Mark, is that something that cloud providers will listen to? Suppose they negotiate an SLA, and it has the uptime, and it has the costs, and it has what has to happen. If then, after that's all signed, the CIO or the CISO says to you, and by the way, if I've got something in my network that's blocking you, pick up the phone and tell me. Is that something that cloud providers are going to be receptive to?
There's a lot of scenarios. In most scenarios, I would say no, because we don't monitor our customers' networks. Mm-hmm. We can tell if there's an issue on anything that we own and manage, in which case we do report immediately to customers. Transparency is one of the most fundamental values in Microsoft. It's something we're trying to engineer into every product and service. We recently opened up a trust center in Redmond, Washington, where we will bring our government customers in. We will share our source code with you so you can review the source code, so you can be comfortable with it. There's no back doors, there are no holes. We'll share a lot of information. It's a very important value for us.
And so if there is a security incident at a cloud provider, Steve, what if it's not part of the infrastructure you're using? Do you still want to know about it?
In some cases we do. And fundamentally, it comes down to just the basic risk equation: vulnerability, impact, likelihood, and threats. Okay. Now, what the cloud does is it shifts this paradigm slightly, because we know the threats that are attacking our agencies. We have a pretty good grasp on that. We've been working with that for years. What we don't know is every single threat that wants to attack, say, someone like Microsoft. Okay. And so what can happen is you can end up being collateral damage during an attack. attack because a threat was actually targeting another agency or another customer, but you just happen to be on that same platform or that same service. It does get back into, how much information does that cloud provider share, especially vulnerability information. Melinda spent a bit of time talking about, the incident response aspect. Well, that's when it's already hit the fan and we're cleaning up the mess, okay? We need to know beforehand what type of risk we're assuming. And to do that, we need accurate vulnerability information from these cloud providers. And I think CDM is going to solve part of that, but CDM is not going to solve an issue of where a researcher comes to you and says, hey, I got this new 0-day, look, I can breach your service. Okay, and at some point, the cloud provider and the government have to agree that, well, Microsoft or whoever the cloud provider is, you can't accept that risk on my behalf. You have to let me know about that risk so I can make informed decisions about that risk.
Okay, and Melinda, can it be the case that, especially in a highly virtualized world where everybody's got virtualized applications and so forth, even networks, running in a cloud, can a cyber incident against a specific target spill over into other areas when everyone's virtualized and so turn into a physical denial of service attack? If I'm making sense. In other words, can it spread from one to the other, even especially in a virtualized environment?
So if you ask a cloud service provider, they'll tell you that if everything is properly partitioned, that should not happen, right? But reality is anything is possible. That's why I think right now, as we continue on this cloud journey, government agencies and the cloud service providers are actually working very hard to come to that right partnership balance in terms of sharing of information. And it's trust, right? It's trust that goes both ways. To what degree do the cloud service providers trust us to give us all this insight into their environment when all really what we want to do is really understand what the potential risks are? So that's still an evolution in progress.
Yeah, because the alternate is to go back to a hosted environment in a cage that's your own servers and stuff, and that's not cloud computing at all because you lose all that scaling up and down that are supposed to be the virtues of the cloud.
Right, correct, indeed.
Okay, so let's move on to CDM specifically, because the question we're hearing a lot today is how does continuous diagnostics and monitoring, relatively easy, I put that in air quotes, for my own company or corporate or agency infrastructure, but when it's in the cloud, how does that all work? And I guess I'm asking for exploratory here. How does it all work, or how do you envision it working? Steve, we'll start with you.
Sure. So when we look at continuous diagnostics and mitigation as a program, we actually look at it as a subset of continuous monitoring as a whole. So Cloud Provider has 300 some odd controls. We expect to see each of those controls assessed at some frequency. Okay, maybe some controls are daily through scans. Maybe some controls like policy controls are yearly through an assessment. Okay, but we expect to see the whole gambit covered. Now, some continuous monitoring is like trusted internet connections, and this is a challenge with cloud providers. How do you make sure that you're meeting the requirements of trusted internet connections? All your traffic is flowing in and out through a tick point, and then at the same time still have the virtue of the cloud of, well, we expand because we have points all over the world that you can access. This is a real challenge, and from a monitoring perspective, it's a challenge because if you're not sending everything through that tick, you're not seeing all the traffic and maybe not seeing an attacker. On the CDM side, what we're looking at is more along the lines of, are we going to get those same data feeds from the cloud provider that we are providing in-house right now with the tools we have? So we have SCAP, which is a format that we use to collect the data, and we have Cyberscope, which we feed that information up into. And what we expect from the cloud providers is that same level of transparency that we give in our own networks right now. And some cloud providers are further ahead than others in being able to provide that capability.
And does your tick scale up if you expand rapidly, and take more capacity from the cloud? Is it a choke point for agencies, or is it a scalable kind of solution?
It's in many cases, it depends on how you purchase the tick. In many cases, it is a choke point. And to my colleague Gary over here, his comment about network and resilience, something that's very important when you're going to the cloud from a risk perspective is you need a very mature network infrastructure, because now instead of everything being in that data center down the hall, it's going across the internet. And so if your networking infrastructure isn't up to snuff and your communication channels aren't clean as a whistle, you're going to have problems when that first cloud outage occurs.
Okay, so Mark, when you have all these demands on your infrastructure, say 30 controls that a particular customer needs to know, how does it work if this customer has 30 and that one has 30 and only 50 of them coincide? Well, now you're up to 40 and so on.
Yes. You do standardize as much as you can across the platform. So you take a collection of all the customer requirements and you pull those requirements together. Where can you map commonalities? And you report out on that common base. It's how we run our continuous monitoring program today. And as you come onto the program or onto our platform, we will provide you with the continuous monitoring guide so you can see what reports you're getting, what data you're getting, and the frequency of getting that data.
So if a customer were to say, well, I want the cherry vanilla flavor of monitoring for this particular condition, you might be in a position to say, well, if you take the lemon cherry, I can give you the same thing, and it'll be much more efficient because I have 5 customers already using that.
Yes, and depending on what type of service you're looking at, infrastructure and platform as a service, you have a lot more flexibility of what you can and cannot do. The finished services, software as a services, you are somewhat limited today, but once again, we're changing product every day. So,
yeah, it's complicated. Gary, is that something that sounds like has resonance with you? In other words, if you've got the controls you want, would you accept a cloud provider suggestion? Well, if you try these controls, I can really give you more information.
Oh, absolutely. So a couple of things, right? I think one of the things that's you're starting to see across industry is a lot of standardization of the types of controls. I mean, you start to see that there are basic things that everyone needs to see. So that helps with some of that commonality. But then you look at the cloud providers, one of the reasons why you go to a provider is they have expertise that you may not necessarily have. And you certainly don't, I would never, take a recommendation from Microsoft and go, what do they know about, security and cloud computing? That would be ridiculous to dismiss that. So if I've got, whether it's Microsoft or any other cloud provider coming in and saying, hey, Gary, you've asked for these 30 things, but really you want to look at these other 5 that you haven't even asked me for, I think you would really be putting yourself at risk to not at least heed that advice and take a look at those things.
So that gets us back to the SLA question. You can't possibly conceive of everything that would need to be in a service level agreement at some point. It's supplier relations and trust and partnership, I guess.
Absolutely.
So those aren't too vague to be able to be part of the whole equation in cloud computing,
No.
especially from a security standpoint. And so tell us about CDM, where you are in that, and how it translates from your own networks to the cloud providers.
So we're kind of in the infancy of that, right? And I think a lot of agencies that are migrating things to the cloud are really starting to just get into that. CDM is really starting to really get into its early stages of really being significant, from a standpoint of what it really means to be doing that kind of continuous monitoring. We do obviously a lot of, we've got varying levels of monitoring inside our network. As you start to expand out with providers, it's still kind of a relationship building kind of, we're still all kind of, I think, treading some new ground here as we really roll into this world of get away from the old world of FSMA certifications and the paperwork drill and really getting into the real-time kind of monitoring types of environments that we all know that we need to be in. And I think we're all kind of progressing that way.
And Melinda, we've been talking about network monitoring, but you also have application and web services monitoring, which is not strictly network monitoring. And so if the application is hosted in the cloud, you might have controls you want on that application, but then they become cloud-based services too in some way. Right. Or do you keep the controls locally and use the network to do the monitoring for the application? Or how does that all work?
So it's going to be a little bit of all of the above. I want to go back to actually an earlier point that was made here. I think we are seeing this conversation coming back full circle to FedRAMP certification, because at the end of the day, yes, you may have some certain recommendations from Microsoft, but it's about that baseline. It's about that FedRAMP baseline and the, I think, 10 additional requirements that the FedRAMP JABS program specifically requires. To see that once you have that in place, I think anything else would be really just gravy on top that's customized or unique to each specific agency. But back onto continuous monitoring, at least with the Department of Justice, we, and I think several other agencies are also along on this continuum as well, is essentially having an automated asset management solution in place, having that visibility to each endpoint within your environment. So it's not just about the network, it's about what's on your desktop, what's going on that server, what is that laptop doing. Having all of that information fed back in an automated fashion will help give the agency that visibility, but also it helps the cloud service provider better understand what's going on in their environment. And for the cloud service provider and the federal agency to be able to use that same common set of information, that ultimately is sort of that's the holy grail we're trying to embark on right now. Cloud service providers, I think there are certainly hesitation in terms of disclosing all that information to the government, but that's the point where we need to get, is to bring in all those endpoint information for the government agency to see and ultimately to submit up through Cyberscope to DHS to OMBs as part of what's within that department's environment, whether it's on-premise or off-premise through the cloud service provider.
So it's almost like you have to virtualize your own environment together with the cloud environment.
Yes.
So that it appears as one.
Exactly.
So the ideal would be like not to use a cliche, but a single pane of glass to be able to see all of that.
Yes.
And how far are we from that? Is that closer than brokerage?
No, I think it is closer. We do, so at least within Justice, we do have a solution in place where we do have visibility to all of our endpoints. And now the next step is getting the cloud service providers to join us on that journey. We do have some cloud service providers that are further along on that cooperation in terms of giving us that endpoint visibility. And then there are others that are still a little bit more hesitant, and for good reasons, but we need to build that trust, and we need to establish their trust so that they can share that information with us and further that
And when you
progress.
say endpoint, does that include untethered endpoints, mobile devices?
Yes, yes. So phones, that in terms of mobile phones, iPads, that's a separate category. What I'm really focused on for now I say, is the workstations, the servers, the laptops, mobile devices. That's probably an entire radio show.
Just let me address that for a minute. Make sure when you're talking with your cloud service provider, you tell them the objectives that you look for. While we may not have it in the continuous monitoring program, there may be other ways for you to get that type of data. And you're not an expert on our platforms, but we are. So we can help you find ways to get those data points that you're looking for.
Okay, good. That's a good place to take a break on. Our guests today are Gary Bartlett, the Chief Information Officer of the Postal Service Inspector General. Melinda Rogers is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Justice Department. Steve Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer for the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. And Mark Williams, the Chief Security Officer at Microsoft Federal. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Reducing Risk in the Cloud for Government, sponsored by Microsoft, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.